Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring you content that will help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today I'm going to attempt to tackle the subject of food addiction. And it's quite a contentious issue in a lot of circles about whether it's real, whether it's not real, and how we might think of it. And this video was inspired by a post that I saw in a Facebook group where someone was saying they're struggling with sugar addiction and they were looking for some advice. And the next 8 or 9 commenters all said, there's no such thing as sugar addiction, there's no such thing as food addiction, you just need to give yourself permission to eat, there's some restrictive thinking going on, that's why you're binging, but the addiction isn't a thing. And the argument that comes up again and again for why food addiction doesn't exist is that there's no scientific evidence for it. But you can't prove a negative. And for decades, there was no scientific evidence to prove that smoking was harmful for health. Yet people were saying, no, this is my experience. I think smoking's harming my health. And the tobacco companies were all saying, no, smoking's fine. It doesn't harm your health. It might even enhance your health. And this went on for much longer than it should. So I think to use that as a reason to be so certain about your opinion, I think is a bit of a mistake and not helpful, particularly as professionals. And these were professionals that were replying to this post. And addiction is problematic to even be able to explain what it is. So addiction is to be physically and mentally dependent on something. Now that sounds straightforward enough, but the DSM-5, which is the big-ass manual with all the different diagnoses and mental health conditions in, got rid of the word addiction because it was too much of a problem when it comes to trying to diagnose someone. So even what used to be alcohol addiction has been replaced with alcohol use disorder. And gambling addiction now comes under an impulse control disorder, and I think it's just called gambling disorder. So the medical field are moving away from this word addiction, and I think that might be another reason why people say food addiction isn't a thing. It's too problematic because we are all physically dependent on food, obviously, and to a large degree we're all quite psychologically dependent on food as well. So then how do we say when somebody has a food addiction and when they don't? It seems like a bit of a problem, so it's easier to say it doesn't exist. And the argument that is used again and again is that you can't be addicted to something that you physically need to survive. And my answer to that would be, why not? There's such an assumption in that statement that when you stop to really question it, why can't you be addicted to something that you need to survive? In order for something to become an addiction, it has to start having negative consequences. There has to be an increase in tolerance. And all these things can happen with food, but they can't happen with the other things that we need to survive. So that I'd say there's 4 actual things that we have to have in order to stay alive. And they are oxygen, water, food, and shelter. Well, you're not going to have any negative impacts of like breathing too much oxygen unless, you end up overdosing on oxygen, which is not possible unless you're in some kind of weird hyperbaric chamber. You can't overdose from you can't have a negative effect from having too much shelter. And it's really difficult to have any negative impacts from drinking too much water as well. But with food, I'm sure we can all agree that consuming way more food than we physically need can have a real detrimental effect on us. So it's a little bit different to the other things that we need to survive anyway. So I don't think that argument really holds up to scrutiny. We also know that in order for something to be an addiction, it tends to hijack the reward pathways in the brain. Well, food is a rewarding experience. It's designed to be that way so that we are compelled to eat. And we know that food, particularly processed foods, foods that have been changed to really overstimulate the reward pathways, are flooding our brains with dopamine and all these other chemical changes in the body and the brain that a lot of people who have other addictions might experience. So there's certainly addictive behaviours and a certain change in our body chemistry that can come as a result of eating certain foods. And if we, kind of take the idea that people can become addicted to gambling, They are getting dopamine hits, their body chemistry is changing when they're gambling, and so that could happen with food as well, and we could become addicted to certain chemical states in the body that could be seeking out rather than food itself. And so the other thing with food is, like, if we're saying that it could be an addiction, are we saying it's a substance use disorder like alcohol, or are we saying it's a behavioural thing like gambling? Is it the food that we're addicted to, or is it the eating, the going through the motions of eating that we're addicted to? I would say most people that struggle with food or identify as having a food addiction or an addictive relationship or compulsive relationship with food, it's certain types of food which tend to be more highly processed. So there has been an argument actually of putting forward a diagnosis of processed food disorder or processed food use disorder. I'm not quite sure how the experts would word it, but this idea that certain processed foods have an impact on our body chemistry, and we don't know what's going on in someone else's body. It might be for you or for people you know, or like people you're seeing on Instagram, when they've given themselves permission to eat what they want, they have found peace. Their compulsivity has reduced because restriction was a big part of it. And I think that is the case for the majority of people who struggle with binge eating. But I'm not going to sit here and say it's the case for everybody, because we make this assumption that all our bodies and brains and thoughts are responding in a way that's much more similar to us than what's probably true. We also know that a lot of people who struggle with alcohol or drug addiction, when they kick that addiction, quite often they move into having a compulsive relationship with food, and they're reporting that the way they feel about food, the cravings and the way they're responding to food is mirroring what they were doing with the alcohol or drugs. So like this idea of food as this addictive, that we can have an addictive relationship with food, I think is possible. But then the problem is, if we are saying then that food addiction is a thing, what are we supposed to do with that? What's the answer? Most of the time we think of like any addictions, the answer is abstinence. You know, if you're an alcoholic, the answer most people would say is give up alcohol. And the problem with food, of course, is that it comes into something that we need in order to survive. So then people think, well, then I should try and cut out certain foods. But then that can then trigger restriction. So it's hard to know whether it's an addiction or whether it's a restrictive response. And I'm not sitting here saying that I know the answer. I'm not sitting here telling you that food addiction is definitely a thing, but I am open to it. And if I've got a client coming into me and saying, I believe I am struggling with sugar addiction or something like that, I'm not going to sit here and say to them, no, you aren't. That can't be true, because there's no scientific evidence for it. Like, as professionals as well, we need to meet people where they're at. And if you're sitting with the question, am I addicted to food? Am I not addicted to food? Okay, the scientific evidence isn't out there. Could you become your own experiment? Could you start off with, is it possible for me to heal my relationship with food? Is it possible for me to give myself more permission and to feel more free to eat what it is that I'm craving, and just paying attention and noticing to how I am and how I'm making food decisions, and finding out if that can work for you. I do worry that there are some people that are stuck in the permission stage. Often people talk about it as a stage, like this stage where as soon as you start doing intuitive eating, you go out and you eat everything that you can get your hands on. And I think for people who've been severely restricting, that might be the case. But what if this food addiction is a thing? What if those reward pathways or whatever that goes on in the brain in addiction is playing out for some people, and we're saying just keep giving yourself permission because you'll be able to regulate this? Maybe they can't. I don't know. And I think each person needs to find that out for themselves by becoming their own science experiment, as opposed to somebody sitting opposite them saying that you're this or you're that. And so people might go to OA if you've got an addiction. That's one possibility, is you join a 12-step program. The OA is problematic in so many ways, because a lot of their programs involve like sticking to a really strict food plan, which often looks like dieting. It looks like not eating enough for some people, and I think it's really important, if you're going to do a food plan that you decide you need to stick to in advance, that it is generous enough, because it can be really easy to slip into that diet mindset. And one of the criticisms of OA is that it can be a little bit like a diet club. But my question would be, if you really believe that abstinence is the only answer for you, is that going to bring you peace? Because ultimately, if you think I'm someone who's addicted to food, the question is, what's going to bring me peace? There are people who tell their stories of giving up sugar, having been addicted, seeing themselves as addicted to it, and finding peace. So maybe for some answer that is the route for freedom. To me, in my experience, that always felt like a really restrictive option and something that I just knew wasn't going to work for me. But I can't then make that assumption that that's what everybody else needs as well. So I think when it comes to like where I sit on the food addiction debate, I have some really strong opinions that we shouldn't have such strong opinions about it, and that we should be open to possibilities, and how does it serve you to look at your situation in order to find freedom. So I'm going to leave it with you and let you make up your own minds. I'll see you on the next video.